stuff. But about the
Order, please. This is the Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today is December 3rd, 2013. It is meeting number 7.
Our study into the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. As a witness today, we have David Petrashek, who is a professor at the University of Ottawa. Professor, I understand that you've already been informed by our clerk about the length of the presentation, so please take the time you need. I'll decide how long the question and answer response is going to be based on how much time is left so that all the parties get an equal chance to ask you questions and to hear your responses.
Okay.
Thank you.
It says your mic's on. It kind of seems it's hard to hear, though. But, I guess I put this on to hear.
I will try to be louder.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me. Well, that's going to be... My name is Professor David Petrashek. I'm an associate professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. I'll speak about 3 issues, briefly introduce myself, but then I'll talk about the current situation as far as I can report on it, particularly post the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Sri Lanka, some actions that are important for the international community to pursue regarding the human rights situation in Sri Lanka, and then maybe this question of where Canada can best use its influence on the situation. First, briefly, just to help you in terms of your questioning, in terms of my own expertise, I'm not, there are many human rights experts on Sri Lanka, of course in Sri Lanka particularly, and I see from the witnesses you've already had that you've spoken to some of them, including, of course, Saravanamutu, who came in, and the level of detail and knowledge they have on the current day-to-day events far exceeds what I can relate to. So my particular involvement with Sri Lanka is I did human rights fact-finding missions there on behalf of non-governmental organizations, but that was in the 1990s. And I've kept abreast of the situation there for probably 15 or 20 years, but a bit at a distance. So I followed the human rights developments there, but not in the kind of case-by-case way you would have if you spoke to the researcher from Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International. I also, during the ceasefire phase, when there was a ceasefire in Sri Lanka during the negotiations with the LTTE, I was asked by the former president's special advisor on the peace process to be part of a small advisory group that he convened to help the government think through some of the difficult issues. And I came onto that group as an international human rights lawyer. That was from 2004 to 2006. I visited the country I think five times for various periods. Most recently, I attended a civil society conference there in June. And my real expertise on Sri Lanka would be in relation to the UN's role and what the UN mechanisms can do, and in relation to the interplay between the human rights issues in the country and the broader peace and reconciliation issues. Okay, so the current situation post the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, as the previous testimony you've heard before the committee demonstrated, there's a worrying deterioration in the human rights situation. You would expect post-2009, at the end of the war, that things would have improved. In fact, certain trends suggest things are there's a renewed call to be worried. As I think Saravanamutu said to you, he would describe the situation in Sri Lanka as post-war and not post-conflict, because the broader reconciliation that's needed in the country hasn't by any means happened. Just a few key points, and really these are to emphasize points that have already been made to your committee. First, the government's failure to address in a serious way the very credible allegations of war crimes committed by both sides in the civil war that ended in 2009, especially in its brutal final phases. Secondly, the increasing militarization, including in areas of civilian administration. This is particularly noticeable in the north, but also in the south. It's interesting in Colombo, responsibility for urban development in Colombo rests with the Secretary of Defense. Thirdly, interference with the rule of law. Others have spoken to you on this point, most notably, of course, the impeachment of the Chief Justice in an arbitrary and unlawful manner, but also the constitutional amendments that have been pursued to extend presidential term limits and other ways that increase the power of the president and, in fact, his family. Fourth, an intolerance for dissent. Now, there is still, to some extent, a critical press in Sri Lanka. You will have heard of the threats that journalists have faced in the country. But there are areas of criticism that, if you like, are increasingly no-go areas, and that particularly includes criticism around the president and his family. Allegations of corruption or personal involvement in illegal practices are likely to get you in trouble. And then fifth, I would draw attention to, as others have, the emergence of a new and perhaps orchestrated set of sectarian clashes. Most notably, the rise of this BBS, this extremist Buddhist group, which has been leading various campaigns against the Muslim community in Sri Lanka. Quite a new development and quite worrying in that country's context, in the context of that country. I would also note, though, as others have, the continued popularity of the government. Frankly, were elections held today, the government would most likely win. That relates to the dividend the government has from successfully concluding the war against the Tigers, but also relates to the perception of economic progress in the country. Although the economic situation in the country is not my area of expertise at all, you can see, returning to Colombo after several years, you can just see the building, the cranes, the parks that are being redone, the sense that this is a country that's booming, investment is coming in, and there's this perception of economic progress, at least in parts of the south. I think the elections in the north for the National Provincial Council, which we weren't sure would take place, which did take place in September, which of course the Tamil National Alliance overwhelmingly won with 80% of the vote. That was a good sign that those elections were held. And another good sign, speaking frankly, is that despite the government's failure to pursue accountability and to pursue reconciliation efforts, despite that, there's, as far as I'm aware and able to say, no sign of a return to Tamil militancy. The defeat of the Tamil Tigers was a good thing. This was a group that committed horrendous human rights abuses, and the defeat of its leadership in particular. I wished it would have happened in a different way, and there were many abuses, the human rights abuses, that did happen in the context of the defeat of that insurgency. But the fact that it was defeated was a good thing, including for many Tamils who suffered under the LTTE administration. The sense that the Tamils in the north and east, who are not yet confident and trustworthy of the government for good reason, nevertheless, my sense in talking to people I know and trust in the country, they feel that the possibility for an armed or militant faction to reemerge is simply the civilian population has no appetite for it whatsoever. On the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, briefly, a public relations disaster for the government, frankly. As the International Crisis Group said, it's pointed out, it's the lowest attendance on record of heads of state or government for a Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. In addition to our Prime Minister, of course, 2 other Prime Ministers boycotted the meeting, also citing human rights concerns. International media coverage at the event, for those of you who followed it, was extremely negative. The President was quite shocked. Every time he appeared in front of the press, all they wanted to know was about Sri Lanka's human rights record. They weren't the least bit concerned with what the discussions were in the Heads of Government meeting. British Prime Minister Cameron's visit to Jaffna was widely covered. The fact that people were stopped from meeting him and that there were protests also created a fair bit of attention. So I think it's fair to say that it was a public relations disaster for the President. He hadn't wanted it to happen that way, and it played out badly for him. And despite the kind of muzzling or the intimidation of the local press, which were unable to fully report on the extent of this disaster, I think most people in Sri Lanka who follow things got that sense that things went badly for the President. The role that our Prime Minister's boycott played in that, we could perhaps take up in the questioning, because I think it's an interesting point. In terms of what changes are sought, I'm going to take up too much time, so I won't go through the list. Most of the recommendations I have would make have already been made to by Saravana Mutu, and if you see other human rights experts, they'll make similar recommendations. They're in 3 areas: accountability, rule of law, and devolution. Those are the 3, devolution, reconciliation, the 3 or 4 key areas. We can take that up in the questioning if you like. I should say that a number of the reforms that are required are reforms that the government's own Lesson Learned and Reconciliation Commission made in its report, which was not a perfect report by any means, but it did make some good recommendations. And if the government simply acted on its own Commission's recommendations, it would go some way towards meeting, towards doing what's required. Okay, to come to the crucial point, what are the points of leverage and the influence for the Canadian government? What can Canada do about the current situation? I think we could act through thinking multilaterally first, acting multilaterally. To work through the Commonwealth now, frankly, and I'll speak frankly, it would be a waste of time. Not only is the chairmanship now held by Sri Lanka, but in fact the Commonwealth Ministers Action Group, which is the group within the Commonwealth responsible for pursuing human rights issues, now includes the Sri Lankan foreign ministers. So there's simply no hope of action, serious action through the Commonwealth, and I think we should just be honest about that. The second key venue is the United Nations Human Rights Council, the intergovernmental body that meets 3 times a year in Geneva. Others have spoken to you about it. You'll know that in its sessions in 2012 and 2013, it passed a resolution, specific country resolution on Sri Lanka. It's something the Council rarely does. It rarely passes a resolution just on one country. It usually deals with issues thematically and increasingly so. But it was able, under U.S. leadership, it was able to build a cross-regional support for such a resolution that held its votes in 2013. The resolution will come up for debate in March 2014. Canada needs to work very, very strongly, and I know its diplomats are keenly aware of this, so I'm not saying anything that they're not aware of, but the passage of that resolution in March 2014 will be a key point of leverage. Sri Lanka does care what the UN says for all kinds of reasons. They do care, they pay attention, the government feels under pressure and scrutiny, and if that resolution doesn't pass, it will be giving the government a carte blanche. I won't go into the detail of the resolution, what it might take up. We can talk about that in the question and answers. So that's multilaterally, we have to focus on the Human Rights Council. This is the key venue. It's the one that's shown it can take action, and the point is to sustain the action and the pressure. Bilaterally, what can Canada do at a bilateral level? Frankly, given the degree of antagonism engendered by the boycott, and we can come to whether that was a good or a bad thing, and my own view is that the boycott was the right thing to do. But I don't see that Canada is going to have much influence at a public level on the big issues around accountability. I think we have to work multilaterally through the United Nations and use our influence there in coalitions with other countries, because the Sri Lankan government can too easily portray independent Canadian initiatives as, they'll portray them the way they portrayed the boycott, which was that this was simply a matter of domestic politicking, and therefore undermine the sense that this is a principled position. So bilaterally, I would think we should work at a different level, and I would make 2 practical suggestions. One would be, there's a sizable population of Canadian citizens who may have dual citizenship or may be entitled or not to dual citizenship in Sri Lanka, but who may have interests there, legal interests, property, other interests. These interests are under threat. There's a new land transfer law which will make it difficult, as I understand it, it's quite complex, will make it difficult for transfers of land in family passing to, if a member of the family is now a foreigner. At the same time, there's been a tightening up of the dual citizenship rules. The result is that Canadian citizens of Sri Lankan ancestry who may have land which they haven't, that's in the family, the mother may die and they may not be able to recover that land. That's an interest that Canada can raise as a practical matter, defending the rights of its citizens in other countries. It's also a very important human rights issue, but it can be raised as a legal issue and an issue that no one can doubt the government's right and, frankly, the justness of it raising the issue. Every country is expected to act to defend the rights of its citizens in other countries. So it's a practical issue. It's very important, particularly in the north, where this will come up. Similarly, around the census of deaths. One of the concessions the President made during the Commonwealth, or right after the Commonwealth meeting, was to finally do an accurate census of the number of deaths, which is a huge point of contention. This will be of great interest to a number of Canadian citizens of Sri Lankan ancestry, and it's another issue where the government can engage bilaterally, making sure that that's done properly and effectively. These are practical suggestions, but they're areas where the government's position may actually lead to some results. And then the second area where I think it's important to think about further engagement and support, and perhaps some of this is already happening behind the scenes that I'm not aware of, would be in relation to the Northern Provincial Council. These were the elections in September for this regional body that was created, but the elections were never held for 2 decades. And the body's there. It's now sitting. The Tamil National Alliance has the overwhelming number of seats, 30 out of 38 seats in it. But this, to work and function effectively, this body will need potentially funding, development projects. There's all kinds of areas of cooperation. And I think that's something where the Government of Canada could engage through a development assistance program, perhaps in other ways in terms of technical expertise around issues related to land or policing. And in that context, it would be very important to maintain and build the relations with the Tamil National Alliance, which is the party that is going to be governing, insofar as it's allowed to, is going to be governing in the Northern Provincial Council. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 40 minutes, which means we have time for 6-minute rounds, questions and answer inclusive. We begin with Ms. Grewal, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Petrasek, for your time and your presentation. Well, over the last few weeks in our committee, witnesses have expressed concerns about the Sri Lankan government's lack of action towards implementing recommendations for reconciliation and the growing culture of impunity. So in your opinion, has the recent Commonwealth heads of governments meeting had any impact on the government's attitude towards reconciliation and securing human rights?
I think what it's done is make painfully aware to the President and his closest advisors that this is an issue that's not going to go away. Their strategy of hoping it would go away, I think they must now recognize is failing. Whether it's convinced them, therefore, that they need to take genuine steps is something I can't judge. What's clear is they've taken some superficial steps that have been criticized, and other human rights experts who you've already met or who will testify before you can go into the detail of the inadequacies of the measures announced. But, for example, one concession that's real is to do the census of deaths. This has been a long-standing demand, and they've actually agreed to do this. And if it's done seriously and fairly, that will be a very important thing. And that was done in the wake of the Commonwealth meeting. So I think the fact that it was a public relations disaster has shown the government that this issue is one they need to take seriously, but they may choose to take seriously by adopting another strategy of obfuscation, and they may just look to get around it a different way than they've been trying up to now, as opposed to genuinely addressing it.
Mr. Petrasek, given that the Sri Lankan government has done very, very little to investigate the alleged war crimes and human rights violations during the last stages of the civil war, do you think that a UN-led investigation is necessary, and would it be effective given the government's present opposition?
I think it's necessary, and I think it could be effective, but I don't think it'll happen. It's very hard for me to imagine the political circumstances that would win sufficient votes in the Human Rights Council for the launching of such an investigation. It's a demand that it needs to be made. I'm not very pessimistic about it actually being achieved. But yes, I think if a UN Commission of Inquiry was established, I'm confident, based on the High Commissioner for Human Rights record in the Libya Commission of Inquiry and the current Syria Commission of Inquiry. These have been very serious efforts, and I'm sure that the High Commissioner's Office would put together a serious team and do a good job. They'd have to have access to the country to do a full job, and that's a big question about whether the government would cooperate with them.
I understand that there is increased religious violence in Sri Lanka. More specifically, as you mentioned, it seems that extreme Buddhists are targeting the Hindus, the Muslims, and Christians in Sri Lanka. So what are the implications of this religious violence for reconciliation and securing human rights in Sri Lanka?
Not good. I should say the extreme Buddhist group I mentioned, so far the attacks have largely been against, and they've been sporadic, it's not like it's a daily thing, have been against the Muslim community. There's been a campaign launched against halal in the country, and against the eating of meat, which hasn't traditionally been a big issue in Sri Lanka. So it appears to be being manipulated to isolate the Muslim community, who certainly feel under siege. But the fact that this is happening and that the government has taken insufficient steps to distance itself from it or to address it is not a positive sign for reconciliation. I'll just give you one quick example. There was one of the attacks. There was a mob attack on a Muslim business. I believe it was some kind of a clothing factory, and this was filmed. There was film footage of the people leading the attack. The issue in the press, because there were huge demonstrations then against what had happened, and people were demanding a criminal inquiry. And the government's response to say, oh, no, this family, the family that owns this factory, they've come forward and they've said that you know, they've forgiven the people who led the attack, as if the criminal law was dependent upon the personal act of forgiveness. So, I mean, the manipulation of the legal process in that case was quite clear, and it's quite worrying in terms of the broader reconciliation efforts.
Throughout the civil war, you know, many Sri Lankans, they were internally displaced to escape conflict. So I understand that while many have been able to return to their homes, and there are still thousands that remain internally displaced from your research and investigation. So how susceptible is this group to abuse and human rights violations there?
I think it's a question you should put to other more informed human rights experts who actually have information on the ground, recent information. I don't have recent information about the treatment of the IDPs beyond that's which already been presented to you by Saravana Mutu. So I just won't comment on that, because I don't think I can add anything and don't feel current enough about the situation of the IDPs in the north.
Thank you. We'll go now to Mr. Marston, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome. If my voice holds out, we'll do fine here. There's a couple of things. Sri Lanka being in the chair of the Commonwealth, is there any mechanism that you're aware of that they could be removed?
I think only by a vote of the Commonwealth member states, but it's not going to happen. They had enormous support, and in fact, they were voted in a further endorsement by the Commonwealth. They were voted on to the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group. So
sorry, the signals are already there.
Yeah, I mean, my own view on this. I mean, I know that I've worked with Senator Hugh Segal, who I have enormous respect for, has written about the need to work through the Commonwealth. I just think in the next period, frankly, it's really not worth it. The final declaration of the summit in Colombo made no reference whatsoever to the main issue, which was Sri Lanka's human rights record. It simply wasn't picked up at all.
Well, when you talk about the human rights record, I presume you're aware of the Channel 4 video that was out a year and a half, 2 years ago.
Yes.
It showed a lot of the activities at the close of the war, particularly the violations that took place there. You write about multilateral approach, and you've pretty well dismissed the Commonwealth, and that's understandable from what you've said. But you've referenced the United Nations several times, and would you like to elaborate on just the reasons that you see that significance?
Well, you'll know, because this is the responsibility of your subcommittee, you'll know that the UN's record in relation to the effective protection of human rights is mixed. and that would be and I myself have worked in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I lived for many years in Geneva, and I've seen it very closely. I worked there with Louise Arbour at one point when she was High Commissioner, so I've seen it close up and from a distance as someone who's lobbied it. So I'd be the first to say it has many failings and to recognize those. However, sometimes things work out, and in the Sri Lanka case, you have, for complicated reasons, managed the U.S., but not the U.S. alone, have managed to build sufficient pressure to pass a resolution with 25 of the 47 members of the Human Rights Council, or 24, voting in favor. And anyway, many abstained, but enough votes to get a reasonably decent resolution. It's not one of your name and shame, but it's saying there's a problem and the government needs to address it. And it's now done that twice. Now, the votes may change in March. There's new members on the council, and that's why countries like Canada need to work harder. But I believe that that experience suggests it has been a point of pressure. The government has gone to enormous lengths to avoid scrutiny in Geneva. They don't like this resolution. They feel they're being watched. So I think, the UN, I think on this issue, the UN is the place to work.
Well, you mentioned they see that they're being watched. I mean, in truth, watching is about all people can really do, is to watch and demonstrate that you're taking into account what you're seeing, the evidence of what's happening there. Beyond that, the ability to influence them is fairly limited, I would suggest. You have written about emerging democracies like Brazil and India and South Africa play an important role in promoting the human rights on the international stage relative to Sri Lanka. How do you see that playing out?
Okay, I'm flattered that you know about my writings.
We have good researchers here.
The resolution on Sri Lanka is primarily led by the WEOG, the Western European and other group, along with the Eastern Europeans. In the UN context, you have these regional groups. But it has attracted support from other regions, including from Latin America. And I don't know the voting record of Brazil on this, but I'm quite sure that there was at least an abstention. And there was support from some other countries. Now, of course, the Chinese are not going to be keen for further human rights scrutiny in Sri Lanka, so they're not a country as an emerging power that's going to be much help on this. Although it's interesting, on November 18th, right after the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, for the first time ever in a statement by the Foreign Minister, a statement on behalf of the Foreign Ministry of China, they drew attention to the Sri Lankan government's need to take concern for human rights in its own way, without outside interference, but still it was seen as a sign that it's not. They recognize that there's a concern there. Whether they'll act on it, it's a different matter. I think what will be important for the success in Sri Lanka is to undermine the Sri Lankan government's argument that this resolution is just Western powers pandering to diaspora politics, or is just because they don't like the fact that they're losing power. There's lots of ways the government has characterized it. As long as India is on board, it's very hard for the Sri Lankan government to make that characterization. So you have India, you have some of the African countries, you have one or two of the Latin American countries. If you could get Japan, which has abstained, if you could get Japan to join the vote at the Council, that would be very important, for example. That's the way to undermine this argument about this just being a Western plot.
Could Canada take a leadership role in pulling that together, do you think?
Behind the scenes, there's a lot we could do, yeah.
Yeah, behind the scenes. They're not particularly listening to us up front.
But on this issue, frankly, behind the scenes may be an effective way of working in Geneva to build such a coalition.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Schellenberger, please.
Thank you very much, and I found your presentation quite interesting. Again, you've written, and you've primarily answered part of this, you've written that Sri Lanka can rely on its growing relationship with trading partners like China, and that it does not rely on the West, so it becomes hard to pressure the Sri Lankan government to address human rights abuses. There are, however, many Western countries that currently make up major trading partners with Sri Lanka: the United States, UK, Germany, Belgium, to name a few, all of which are vocal on human rights issues in the world. Similarly, India has been a major supplier to Sri Lanka and recently boycotted the Commonwealth Summit. Would it be difficult to implement sanctions against Sri Lanka? How difficult would that be?
On a bilateral level, not so difficult. At the United Nations level, impossible. But no, Canada could take economic measures against Sri Lanka. The European Union has already, because of the human rights situation in Sri Lanka, has already taken certain measures. These things are impactful. On the other hand, they're also offset by Sri Lanka's growing economic relationship with China. So the declining European or American investment may be offset by rising Chinese and other Asian investment in the country. So the economic, the leverage of the economic stick is it hasn't, Sri Lanka, let's put it this way, Sri Lanka hasn't shown that it was concerned enough about the European Union measures that it was willing to take steps to keep preferential access to European markets, which in some respects, I don't know the technical details, it lost as a result of its human rights record.
Okay. You mentioned earlier, too, that there's many, around Colombo, many cranes and building going on and that type of thing. Is the investment coming in, like, is it fact or fiction that there's great investment going into Sri Lanka?
I don't want to mislead you, and I don't have the details. What I can say is there is real investment, but whether it's going into productive sectors of the economy, I can't say. There's an awful lot of investment in tourism and new hotels, for example. Awful lot of investment in condominium construction in Colombo. But the amount and how significant this is in the broader economic progress of the country, I'm not well positioned to judge. I'm sorry.
Where would that investment be coming from?
It's a lot of it's coming from Asia, but there is significant investment as well from diaspora communities.
Religion usually comes into so many things around this table when we talk. Is this a religious situation? Like you mentioned, the Buddhists and Muslims. But has it been, and is it, a religious situation going on during the war and after the war?
No. No. I mean, people often like to portray some of these sectarian conflicts in religious terms. Religion, insofar as religion is relevant, it's because it's been manipulated. The Tiger suicide bombers, the Tigers essentially invented this technique of suicide bombing, and up until about 2003, pre-Iraq war, still the most people who'd been killed by suicide bombers had been killed by the Tigers, not by Islamist suicide bombers. But the Tigers who did this were Hindus, atheists, or Christians and Catholics. They were all pursuing the same technique. So no, there's a manipulation of religion in the conflict. That would be my answer to that question.
Okay, so the main party in the conflict then is family?
The main problem right now is the increasing monopolization of political power in a very small group of people centered around the president.
Okay, I haven't got any more questions.
In that case, we will move to Mr. Casey, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Professor Petrasek, I'm filling in for Erwin Kotler, but only in the physical sense. There's absolutely no way that I would be able to fill in terms of his experience on matters of international human rights, to be sure. You have written that the decision of Canada's Prime Minister to not attend the Heads of Commonwealth meeting changed the way other leaders engaged. And you also talked here about it being a PR disaster for the government of Sri Lanka. Are there similar things, or are there other things that our Prime Minister or our country can be doing that will have a similar impact in terms of changing the way others engage with Sri Lanka? I know you talked about the UN Human Rights Council. It seems to me that this action by our Prime Minister in this case was, if you will, symbolic. Didn't necessarily involve other countries. Are there other things along the lines that we could do that would have the same impact?
maybe one suggestion. Sri Lanka is reasonably contributes about 1,000 troops a year to UN peacekeeping. Most of them are in Haiti. That's important to the Sri Lankan military. It's important for their prestige. It's not just an income earner. It's important to their sense of who they are as a military, and important to the country. And we're someone to raise questions about the appropriateness of the UN relying on peacekeeping troops, some of the commanders of whom may be implicated in human rights abuses in Sri Lanka, would be a very significant, high-profile, kind of antagonistic approach that might get a lot of attention. I think the point I was trying to make in the piece you refer to was to affect human rights change in a country that's dug its heels in and that has support from other powerful countries, in this case China, is no easy matter, and it's a combination of the carrot and the stick a little bit. I'm not sure whether or not, I have no way of knowing whether when the Prime Minister made his decision to boycott the meeting, he expected that would create a dynamic in Colombo that played out. I just don't know. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I won't speculate. But if others who chose to go had to engage in a different way. Mm. And so the boycott, which was the kind of perceived as the sort of hard measure, and then the attending the meeting, engagement, seemed like the soft measure, right? But the way it played out, actually the boycott seemed much less important than what David Cameron was doing in Colombo. But the two are interlinked. That was my point. I think what you need is a bit more strategizing. And my advice to the government, again, I do not know, so I don't want to speculate. My sense is, it's only a sense, is that when the government 2 years ago, I believe, made its statement, the Prime Minister made a statement almost 2 years ago saying he would not attend the meeting unless certain reforms happened in Sri Lanka. I also wrote a piece at that time saying this is the right decision, but the government needs to build an international coalition. So this action can't be dismissed as just the Canadian government. And I understand some efforts were made, but my view would have been greater efforts could have been made to build an international coalition around that position. And I would urge the government going forward to think about positions that are taken in coalition with others, ideally cross-regionally. Because the more you do it with support from countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the more you undermine the Sri Lankan government's argument that this is just about diaspora politics or just about the West beating up on the poor developing countries or something else. The peacekeeping issue is one. I think the visits, high-profile visits. I don't think President Rajapaksa is going to be suggesting a visit to Canada anytime soon, but people like him like to travel, and there may be other countries he proposes to visit, and maybe we can make with those countries where we have relations indications that we don't think this is deserved or earned, as it were, in the absence of some serious effort to address the human rights situation in the country.
You may or may not be aware that there was a bill introduced in Parliament today to devolve powers from party leaders and down to members of Parliament. Trust me, the timing of this question with the introduction of that bill is purely coincidental. But if we move from the leadership level down to, if you will, my level, an ordinary parliamentarian here in the Parliament of Canada, individually or as a group, what can we do?
That's a good question, and I hadn't anticipated it. You mean in terms of pushing legislation forward?
I would think that would be part of it.
I mean, if I were a parliamentarian now in the current context of Sri Lanka, in terms of a big picture, there's not going to be much that can happen. But I did make recommendations about where Canada could engage with the Northern Provincial Council, with the Tamil National Alliance. I would be thinking about potentially engaging as parliamentarians with some of these politicians in the north who are trying to establish a local government of sorts, which has long been the aspiration of the people there to have their own police force, their own government in the areas where they form a majority. It's going to be a long, hard slog to do it, and they're not going to get much support from their government. But those are areas where parliamentarians can engage legitimately and provide much-needed advice, support, but also potentially introductions to international assistance to help these politicians who are emerging in the north to engage with and receive the help and support of the international community. That would be one area. I know it's not it's not a big picture one, but I just our business interests in the country aren't sufficient enough to give Canada an economic leverage. And my answer to the other question, even when the European Union removed some trade preferences, even that didn't help much in terms of Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka really is not, the government is really not that worried about economic steps we might take. They can offset those. They're worried about prestige. So it's things like, things that deny them visits, things that deny them access to the symbols that they think they are, entitled to as a democratically elected government. Those are the things they're sensitive to.
Thank you, Mr. Casey. Before we turn to Mr. Sweet, I just had a question of my own. You mentioned the peacekeeping, and I just wanted to ask the question, what is Sri Lanka's reputation as a peacekeeper? Looking at it not from the view of what goes on domestically in Sri Lanka, but how their military performs in its peacekeeping role.
I'm not aware of any controversy about that.
So as far as you know, they've been satisfactory.
As far as I know, it's satisfactory. But there is a precedent. The Nepalese government, of course, contributes a lot more troops to peacekeeping. And actually, it's a prestige thing for the Nepalese army, but it's also an income earner, significant income earner. And I think it's not a significant income earner for the Sri Lankan government. But in the Nepalese case, when there was an attempt back in 2006, when there was the agitation to have the king resign, and there were mass street protests, and there was a sense at one point the army was going to be called onto the street, and this was really going, as they say, going south, it looked like. And there was a small human rights office run by the UN in the country, and they wrote to the Nepalese army, they wrote to the Secretary General of the United Nations, copied to the Nepalese army, indicating that any officers implicated in this, of course, that would affect further, that would affect Nepalese army's standing as being legitimate troops to use on UN peacekeeping missions. And the perception from those close to that event suggests this had enormous impact on the Nepalese army. Had a big impact. They said, wait a minute, it was something, they actually saw that this was going to affect their prestige internationally, but also affect something they looked forward to doing. Nepalese troops are, there's thousands of Nepalese troops deployed. So I just suggest this might be one area to consider in terms of, the further down the road we go, a lack of any accountability for the abuses which did happen. Somebody may want to look at this issue.
Thank you. Mr. Sweet, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm really glad you asked that question, and Mr. Petrasek, I'm really glad that you're here today, because you have outlined two unique things, and this will sound like a statement, but I would like you to comment. The NPC, I think, is a great idea for Canada to engage in the North, and this idea regarding, because the UN remuneration is often much higher than what it is domestically for some of the countries that are involved in peacekeeping for their troops. So I think that's, and like you said, the prestige element plays a role in it too. So I think those are both very good ideas, and I know our researchers will capture them for our later report. But I had asked a couple of witnesses previously, and it sounds like you've really reviewed all the testimony. I'm very concerned about the war widows. The numbers of them, I've heard numbers from 40,000 to 90,000, and I think they would primarily, of course, unless they've migrated, would be in the north. Now, are they the responsibility of the NPC? Do you know of any actions that the Sri Lankan regime are taking right now to try and look after their needs? Please elaborate if you can.
You referred to the earlier testimony. I really can't add anything to what you received from Saravanamuthu. He's much more knowledgeable on that issue, and he spoke to you. There is a big debate about the numbers. Hopefully the census will help us, the census of the deaths will actually help us to pin that down a little bit more. But I really can't comment on the adequacy of the programs taken to date. There's a lot of controversy about them. That's what I know. And he elaborated. I think if I got the gist of his response, that there was good and bad. That was my sense. There were steps being taken. They were insufficient. But I can't add to the answer you got from him. I'm sorry.
No, that's no need for apology. In fact, I will go one other area that he commented on too, but you might have some input regarding, and that is the militarization of every public service, the bureaucracy, et cetera. And you had mentioned that the citizenry has basically turned a blind eye to whatever human rights infractions they see because of what's happening in the country, the economy, and et cetera. Is there any movement at all in the general citizenry in regards to their concern with not only the human rights violations but this militarization? Is that not beginning to spawn questions in the general population?
Well, when I was there in June, the first thing I'll say is not everyone's going along with it. Sri Lanka still hosts a very active, brave, and serious civil society, some of whose members have testified to you. And it has always impressed me going there, essentially. So you come there and you're actually quite humble quite quickly in terms of what advice you can provide, because there's no shortage of PhDs running around Sri Lanka dealing with law reform or constitutional issues or what else. What else? So there's a lot of expertise there, and all those people have not got along. A lot of them are very critical. There's very active anti-corruption organizations in Sri Lanka, very active electoral monitoring of election organizations. There's very active organizations still working on reconciliation, on women's rights. I mean, there's a whole range of activities that people are pursuing and are not going along with it. I think what I'd say is in terms of where the president's constituency is, at the point at which it appears that some of the people who are profiting now in a broader sense may not be able to, because in fact the profit is just intended for a very small group, yes, the president could be in trouble. So insofar as the military, which is led by his brother, the defense secretary, as far as that's seen as actually it's about enriching the family and not about spreading the riches more broadly in the constituency that supports him, there are problems that could arise. And you saw that a little bit in relation to the impeachment of the Chief Justice, which related to a personal and business matter that she had got herself involved in. And a lot of the protests that came out in the street there were people who hadn't protested before. And it was a sense that, look, if this can happen, none of us are safe. So having said that, if it came to an election, people might still back the president. But there are areas, you've seen backlash in particular areas, and it could grow and deepen if the economic progress wasn't seen to be shared, at least amongst the constituency. If they're not so concerned about the Tamils in the north, but at least amongst the constituency in the south. And there have been signs that the president is not getting the right advice in terms of just how far he can go in terms of this amassing of political and economic power within his small circle.
There have been some signs, despite the fact that one of the problems with the vibrant civil society, one of the problems with those who would be human rights defenders that would look for legislative reform, et cetera, is that the media at large is still muzzled, is still either self-censoring or have been threatened by the government with the white vans up until now.
Yes, there are problems with the media accurately reporting the situation, but I think even if they did, I'm not sure the president's reading it. It's like anything. It's really it's almost this kind of regal, this sort of court-like approach. It was quite shocking if you watched the coverage of the press conferences around the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. He seemed genuinely surprised at the questions on human rights, which can only indicate that he's getting very bad advice. And that is a typical situation where a leadership, it gets up to the regal level. People simply can't explain. It's not safe to say what is actually the real situation. So the president's living almost in an alternate reality.
Right.
The media could report these things. The president may still not pay attention to them. there's been so many indications of this kind of personal pursuit of power. And you know, Sri Lanka, I think the parliament, I think, has 220 or 230 seats. Somebody will Google it and tell me I'm wrong. But I believe there's 80 ministers. So the approach to any potential source of dissent is simply to continue to, and so everybody is brought in, and you know, and there is no effective opposition in the country for complicated reasons, not just because they're muzzled, but also because of the complicated politics of the country. There is no effective parliamentary opposition. So.
Yeah, before we go to our last question, Monsieur Jacob, I'm just going to ask a question. What is their electoral system? Is it based on ridings? Is it a party list system? Do you have any idea?
It's a complicated system, and I can't get into the details. There are ridings, but there's also some proportional element in it that I'm not exactly sure of. But he in any possible configuration, he and his party still have enormous support.
Right, right. And as a practical matter, I think it would be unwise for us to make suggestions about electoral reform for other countries in this committee. So that was just a curiosity matter for me. Monsieur Jacob, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Monsieur. Mr. Jacob, you have the floor. Thank you, Chair. And thank you to Mr. Petrasek for being here. My first question is this. In your opinion, to what extent does the diaspora, the Sri Lankan diaspora in Canada, have any role to play in our Prime Minister's not traveling? An important question.
I know that one group of people believe it is about winning votes in ridings where there may be significant Tamil population, and another says no, this is a principled position that arose out of a genuine concern for the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. I really am not privy, and the one thing I would say is this. I do not believe that any diaspora community in Canada, new arrival or old arrival, I do not believe it's fair to suggest that the bulk of them would ever vote on a foreign policy issue. I think in any diaspora community there's an element where the policy towards the mother country is a key factor in their vote. But I think the Tamil diaspora, like any diaspora in Canada, has many other electoral concerns. And so the Prime Minister may gain a lot of rhetorical support, but when it comes to the voting day, is this what the Tamils of Scarborough will vote for? Or is it because they're concerned about issues of employment or transportation or Rob Ford? I don't know. I can't speculate. I'm hesitant to simply to suggest a whole community en masse will vote on a foreign policy issue. I just don't see any evidence of that. But I don't know what motivated the Prime Minister.
Merci. Thank you. My second question is this. It deals with Sri Lanka. This boycott, Canada's boycott, was it widely publicized in the Sri Lankan media in Sri Lanka itself, and what was the reaction to the government's decision?
Though at the time of it was widely publicized both 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago when the Prime Minister first stated his intention, and then in October when he made it final that he would not attend. At the actual Commonwealth Summit, it was David Cameron who kind of stole the show for reasons I touched on earlier. But I will say this, whatever my own views or your views are on the decision to boycott, I have yet to meet a member of Sri Lankan civil society who didn't welcome it. Regardless of whether they thought it was done for domestic political reasons. Frankly, they wouldn't care. What they wanted was a very powerful protest signal sent to the Sri Lankan government, and they felt that Stephen Harper did that. So they welcomed it. In June, when I was in Sri Lanka, I attended a conference of civil society, and I made a point of asking people, I said, what do you think? The Prime Minister said he's unlikely to come. Should he come to the Commonwealth Summit? And I didn't find a single one. Some were nuanced, but essentially the almost unanimous view was it was a good idea to boycott the meeting.
Do I have a little bit of time left? My third question is this. You said that the main problem is the concentration of power in the hands of the President of Sri Lanka and his entourage that surrounds him. Can you expand on the dynamic and what the consequences will be for the north of the country?
Very worrying implications for the rule of law, which we've already seen in relation to the changes to the Constitution, which have now have ended the term limits on the President, have affected the judicial appointment structure in the country, and then the impeachment of the Chief Justice. So the continuing narrowing of the circle of power and influence, economic power in this small group, has worrying implications for the rule of law in the country. Sri Lanka's had many problems in the past, but it's going back, several decades. But it has had reasonably fair elections. It has had a reasonably fair policing with some key issues in the north and east. The army. There's always been issues in relation to the armed conflict, but it's not. It hasn't been an authoritarian state, and the tendency is towards that, and that's quite shocking, because for all of Sri Lanka's problems, it wasn't a place when you visited that when you arrived you started being careful about what you said. And on my last visit in June, that was a little bit what I felt, whereas my other 3 or 4 visits had been in the context of a civil war where I never felt there was an issue I couldn't talk about, which is interesting. That the sense, and it's only my sense, but my sense that I was freer to speak out during my visits at a time of civil war than at a time of peace was significant. So my only comment would be to say it's a very worrying almost monopolization of power, attempt to monopolize power, to destroy the institutions Sri Lanka needs to have a proper reconciliation.
Okay. Merci, Monsieur Jacob.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Jacob.
Professor, and I have to let you go and then deal with one item of business after we've dismissed you as a witness. I just had 2 things to bring up with you. The first one is, I had the impression, I could be wrong, that you had more extensive notes and you edited them somewhat in order to comply with the time constraints. If that is the case, I'm wondering if you would be willing to submit the notes you had so that they could be translated and distributed to all of our members.
The only thing I was going to add was I had a series of key points, like what are the human rights reforms that are needed in the country. I made a series of 8, but all of those have already been read into your record by previous witnesses.
Okay.
And if you're looking for a set of clear, solid recommendations, I would direct you to, obviously, to the human rights reports, but also to the work of the International Crisis Group. They have a very active and excellent program on Sri Lanka with very knowledgeable, dedicated researchers, and they've been very detailed policy recommendations, not just on human rights, but also on the reconciliation issues. So I'm happy to give them to you, but there's nothing that won't already be in your testimony.
Okay. And the other question I just wanted to ask you, this may be too broad, but we see on the one hand the militarization of the Sri Lankan political system and economy, the odd juxtaposition of urban development with the military in a single department is a peculiar one, to say the least. On the other hand, you've spoken of the President relying on the party system for power. I'm just wondering, is this a situation in which the support of the military is now essential to maintaining political power, and they therefore must effectively be put in a position where they can be economically rewarded through the rejigging of the power structure, or is that not the case?
No, the military is not in. You may know that at the conclusion of the war, the general who successfully concluded the war actually then was dismissed and tried to run for president, was imprisoned, completely intimidated, and so the president showed that he can take out the generals he wants to take out. The military in Sri Lanka is traditionally, there's never been a fear of a coup or a threat of a coup. It was a very small institution. It's been significantly expanded as a result of the war and actually has grown in numbers as opposed to declining in numbers now that the war is over. But I don't see it as a separate center of political power. Essentially, it's under the clear direction of the civilian administration.
All right.
In relation to your point about urban development, it is an odd juxtaposition, but with an honourable pedigree. You'll remember that it was Napoleon, who of course amassed political and military power, who then took over reorganizing the streets of Paris in the early 19th century. And
Napoleon III, yes, Baron Haussmann.
Yes, yes. So there is this sense of you know, as I said, the regal court, and now I'm going to actually redo the city. It gets a little out of hand, but
that is an interesting parallel. Thank you for that. Colleagues, we are at the end of this meeting. I'm going to dismiss our witness with our thanks and then ask everybody to remain here to deal with one very brief item of business. Of course, Professor, we're not actually kicking you out of the room. We're just allowing ourselves to go on to the next item of business. Colleagues, the clerk... I don't think so. It's just a matter of...
Okay.
Oh, the clerk has handed out a request for a budget, a small budget of $6,500, purpose of which is to essentially finance the bringing in of one of our witnesses. 6,500, I said.
Okay.
Yep.
I'd like to move it as tabled.
All right. Debate? Agreement? All right. Thank you, colleagues. Colleagues, we are adjourned until Thursday.